Coming to you from an undisclosed location deep in the heart of the Santa Monica Mountains, I'm your intrepid host, L.A. Marzulli, and this is Politics, Prophecy, and a Supernatural Report. Very special guest here at ppsreport.com, Chief Joseph RiverWind. Chief Joseph, thanks for coming in. He's got a wonderful new book out. That's what the old ones say. I have read it. It is absolutely a fantastic book, chock full of stories. Let's get into that because I know how 28 and a half minutes goes by, and it goes by really quick. First of all, what tribe are you from? And just tell us a little bit about that particular tribe.
LA, thanks for having me on the show. It's an honor and a blessing.
It's our honor and our blessing.
My people are Arawak, Taino Indians. We're the ones who discovered Columbus wandering lost in the ocean. We were the first ones to be called Indian. The Native American Holocaust, as we call it, began with my people. And we are the original inhabitants of the Caribbean islands and the state of Florida, much before the Seminoles came down in there. And we had prophecies about talking leaves that were coming to our people. We have an oral tradition that spans centuries that has become prophetically taking place, even here, starting with 1492 and beyond.
That's just really fascinating. You talk about talking leaves. Mm-hmm. I know what that is, having read your book, but many folks out there don't know what the talking leaves are. Just give us a short description of what you're talking about when you say that.
Well, one of the prophecies that has been passed down specifically in my tribe was that pale-faced, bearded men, guamiquenas, covered like turtles, would come to our shores in 3 strange war canoes.
Let me just stop you right there. That's such a specific prophecy, covered like turtles, and of course that speaks to what?
The conquistadors in their armor. And the 3 strange war canoes were the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria.
Wow.
And the prophecy said that when these pale-faced, covered like turtle men would come to our shores, that talking leaves would come to our people, and it would be a completed knowledge, a complete revelation of who God was and is. Traditionally our name for God in our language is Yah, or Yahya. And there was a priest on board that ship named Bartolomé de las Casas, and he stepped off that ship with a Bible in his hands. Those were the talking leaves of our prophecies, because it's the word of God that speaks, and the paper is made from the trees. Unfortunately, as we all know, the horrible history that took place with the Bible in one hand and a sword in the other. Mm-hmm. And that in itself was something that to our people, although God had prepared our people for the gospel to come to us, the witness that came with the word was absolutely devastating.
It's almost like the trickster got in there, Satan, Satan got in there and just messed the whole thing up. What could have been an incredible meeting between 2 cultures became really a disaster for your people.
Absolutely.
And many of the other tribes throughout the United States. And we both know this, and that just even now in modernity, in the present day, there's a little bit of reconciliation starting to happen. Just speak to that briefly, please.
Well, one of the things that's taking place, and I want to mention Billy Graham's prophecy that he spoke 40 years ago. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said that the Native Americans were the sleeping giants. And that once we awakened, that we would be the ones that would bring America back to Christ. And literally this year 40 years has taken place. And there's a huge fire of the Holy Spirit that's spreading throughout Native American communities. And not just our generation. We were just at the revival here in LA, where we saw the next generation absolutely on fire for God. And it's that fulfillment of that prophecy of us bringing that word, but only through forgiveness and reconciliation of these past wounds. Mm-hmm.
There's, in many Native American tribes throughout the United States, they talk about the star people. Tell us what the star people were or are, in your opinion.
Well, I can speak from our stories and also some of the stories that I've heard from elders from other nations. Mm-hmm. In many of the accounts, there's one account that comes from the Mohawk people that talks about there was a great battle in the spirit realm, in the heavenlies. And after this battle took place, that there were those who fell here to the earth. There's other stories that talk about how the star people would come down, and we're talking many centuries ago.
This is like what, 2,000, 3,000?
3,000 and
Okay,
back.
just a long time.
Long time ago.
Okay.
And these star people fell from the heavens, and they made themselves out to be gods. And they also took our women. And when I say take our women, I mean in a relations type of non-consensual way.
Okay.
Oftentimes the women would die giving birth to these giants.
Now, I've heard this before. People have asked me questions about this, the idea of Nephilim and how, if they were women of Earth, how would they birth, let's say, a 20-pound baby? I mean, is that what we're talking about? Are we talking about giant babies being born through the women?
Right.
That's what the oral tradition talks about?
The oral tradition talks about that these star people would take our women. The result of that intermixing, that interbreeding, were these race of giants that then covered the land. They were very sadistic, very evil, for using that word, and some of the physical attributes of them. When we say giants, we're not talking about Homo habilis or Denisovan. We're talking 8-9 foot tall people,
even larger,
and even larger. Yeah. 6 fingers on their hands, their toes, double rows of teeth. Oftentimes, they're depicted in the oral tradition as having red hair, and very sadistic sexually as well. The Calusa is one example in Florida. And there's many oral traditions about how they would come. They would take the women. They would also take children, do very sadistic sexual rituals with the children. And then we can see the spiritual connotation of that even today, where Florida is racked with sexual molestations and rapes. Could it be a byproduct of these
almost like a
ceremonies?
generational spirit over land?
Yes, absolutely.
What's interesting, folks, is that what Chief Joseph is talking about here is basically Genesis 6, where it talks about the sons of God. Just substitute star people for that. Saw the daughters of men and took women and married them. And in that exchange, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. And what's interesting about this, according to what Chief Joseph is saying, and you talk about some of that in the book also, that the Nephilim were on the earth and certainly in the Americas. And that is startling. That goes against really the history that we've been taught in our schools. But, you mentioned giants and star people, and this is in Native American oral tradition, certainly in some of the tribes that I've talked to. But there's one account that you told me, which I found very interesting, with 2 tribes that they made a treaty. Tell us about that.
Well, when I was in the service, there was a Mohawk gentleman who was also in the service with me. And he was sharing a story from his people about there was a time where the Allegheny, which is where we get the name for the Allegheny Mountains.
Sure.
That was the name for the giant
And this
tribes.
is, Alleghenies are where?
Up in the northeast area.
Okay.
So
Pennsylvania, New York.
Right,
okay.
The Allegheny Mountains. And according to their oral tradition, they had a very huge stronghold right across the river. And so they would frequently raid. When I say they, the giants would raid the villages, taking the women, taking the men. They would easily, grab a warrior, bite their head off, drink the blood. I mean, that's the sheer size and stature of these giants. Well, the Mohawk put out a call to gather the warriors together because something had to be done.
Sure.
And I'm paraphrasing because there's a very specific way our stories are told, so I'm paraphrasing. And as they gathered the people together, many of the other nations of the Iroquois Confederacy did not want to go against the giants.
Why is that?
Out of fear. Out of fear, because also they demanded tribute as well.
Let me stop you. Folks, go back to the biblical prophetic narrative, which discusses David and Goliath. You remember that the Philistine, Goliath, comes out and blasphemes the God of the Bible, and none of the Israelis, of the Israeli army, will confront this guy. And this is... the parallels to the stories are incredible.
Oh, absolutely. And so the Huron were the ones who answered the call. And so the Huron and the Mohawk sent out 2 scouts. And when they went across the river and they came back, they reported, yes, they're giants, they have a fortified city, but with the Creator's help, we can take them down. And so there was a large battle that took place. The warriors were victorious. And as a result, there's a wampum belt. Now, the northeastern tribes, they use wampum belts to record their stories. And this wampum belt still exists among the people.
Wow.
That records the story of the battle against the giants. And then the Huron and the Mohawk said that forever they will be at peace with one another because they were the only 2 that answered the call to go defeat the Allegheny giants.
Let me ask you something, and this is, question popped into my head here. that battle is how old? 1,000 years?
Oh, there's no, thousands. 1,000,
Okay.
2,000 years
All
old.
right. I'm just wondering if they buried them in a mass grave someplace, and if the oral tradition of those particular tribes, Huron maybe, would know where that burial mound might be.
It's very possible.
Very possible.
I don't know of where it is, but
Okay.
it's very possible.
Cultures around the world have end-time prophecies. Certainly, we have lots of end-time prophecies in our Bibles, which is what, politics, prophecy, and the supernatural report. This is what one of our hallmark words to the show. And cultures around the world have these end-time prophecies. What are some of the prophecies that you would like to share with us today?
Well, L.A., there's several that also correlate biblically. And for those who are watching, I want to remind the listeners and watchers of Romans 1:20. For those who think, well, how would the Native Americans have known God? Well, Romans 1:20 says, "For I have shown myself to every nation of the earth in things seen and unseen. Therefore, man is without excuse." And so we very much knew who God the Creator was. Not all the tribes were monotheistic, but the East Coast tribes were monotheistic and still are, unlike many of the other tribes that are polytheistic. So the prophecies that have been passed down for generations among our people, whenever we say the time when the fires will come, that's an indicator, especially when we're talking with Native people, we're about to speak about end time prophecies. Because one of the biggest prophecies is that once the Creator destroyed the earth with water, and that was to destroy the giants, according to the oral tradition, which is also found in the biblical account.
That's just an incredible statement that the oral tradition in Native talks about a global flood, which parallels the biblical narrative. It's amazing.
And these are pre-missionary contact stories.
Right, pre-Columbian.
Pre-Columbian.
Okay.
And so when we say that the fires come, we know that there was a destruction of the earth by water, and there's going to be a destruction of the earth by fire before Creator comes to restore the world, because fire purifies. So there's prophecies that said that when grandmother spider's web covers the earth, that's an indicator of the fires are really close to coming. What is that to us now? The World Wide Web. We see the internet. Also power lines that are going across everywhere. That looks like a web completely covering the land. Another prophecy, and this was one that I really didn't understand until Creator gave me revelation on it, and it was that the buffalo would cover the land again. And in the natural mind, I'm thinking, how is that possible? With all the cities and towns and everything that's been settled over 500 years, it is impossible for the buffalo to cover the land again. But then a few years ago, the U.S. Mint put out the buffalo nickel coin again.
Wow.
So here we have the buffalo covering the land again. The Hopi prophecies of the gourds of fire that are going to fall from the sky, and that the lakes will burn and boil.
What does that sound like to you?
Sounds like to me like an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, a nuclear missile. Seeing something 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago of technology that's of today, that's how
very difficult to
right.
Okay.
So they describe them as gourds. So we see a lot of this taking place. We see the World Wide Web. We see the iron snake, or the snake of metal, that would also cover the land of the Americas, of Turtle Island, and that was the railroad. So many of these prophecies have come to pass already, and there's still more that we're waiting to happen. But we know that we're at a time where time is short, which is one of the reasons why I wrote this book. During my time in the service, I wasn't walking with the Lord. I wasn't walking with God. My father was a pastor for 30 years.
Wow.
And I decided in my own wisdom, because of my own hatred and bitterness towards the Spanish and the Europeans for what they did to my people, I said, you know what, forget all this, forget Christianity, forget the Bible. I'm going to go back to the traditional ways of my people. And in doing so, I was able to participate in ceremonies from tribes across the land, and I kept hearing these same stories that were right out of the Bible. For example, the Choctaw. The Choctaw have a story about when Creator came to a man named Nuah and told him to build a large canoe and put 2 of every animal in that canoe because the earth would be covered with water.
Amazing.
And again, this is pre-missionary. These stories go way back, but we can't be surprised, really.
We talk about the oral tradition, and what's amazing to me is that many anthropologists and archaeologists sort of dismiss the oral tradition, not only of Native Americans, but of indigenous people all over the world. And tell us about why the oral tradition of many of the tribes should be looked at in a very important way. What gives it validity, in your opinion?
I think a great example would be the Quinault tribes. The Quinault have a story about when the Thunderbird fought with the great whale. And as a result of this fighting, there was a great earthquake that shook the coast. And shortly after that, there was a tsunami that hit the coast and wiped away thousands of people and villages. So this oral tradition has been passed on for generations. And it hasn't been until recently that anthropologists, scientists, and even geologists, seismologists, now we know of the Cascadia subtonic plates that are subduction plates, where these plate tectonics are hitting, creating tsunamis, and they went to the oral tradition of the native people and were able to say, look, here's this oral tradition of the thunderbird fighting the whale, an earthquake that took place, a tsunami that took place, and now with the science that we have today, they've been able to find these plates, that would absolutely validate that oral tradition of how the native people interpreted what took place. So there's a validity there as well. And it's still an upward battle. It's still a fight to get the scientific community to take stock in our oral tradition. One thing that oftentimes is missed is, here I'm paraphrasing the stories, but there are people in the tribes that are chosen from birth to be the story keepers or storytellers or wisdom keepers. When they learn a story, it is word for word. They can't change a word, they can't add a word, they can't add a plural to it. It has to be told the exact same way. So when we're hearing these stories at the ceremonial grounds, we're hearing the story the same way it was told 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. That was our people's way of keeping the integrity of the story intact.
And that person is just tell us how a child is then sort of handpicked and then groomed to do this. Tell us about that.
Well, once the children are picked, and it's a selection process, and those who have that aptitude for really remembering the stories and have the mental capacity to retain these stories, that child is chosen and raised, and they're continuously learning the stories by repetition.
Are there people today in the tribes that you know of that still a story keeper, for lack of a better word? Are there story keepers alive today?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely, there are. Most people on the outside of the reservations or the people, you're not going to find them. But it's just like with the medicine men and the holy men of the tribes. Our people know who they are. And I mean, you can imagine, these people that are found and they get inundated, but their whole sole purpose is to keep these stories alive for their tribes. So yes, there are many who still.
That's incredible. Let's get into the book a little bit. What is one of, and we've we're already the window of time is shrinking very rapidly. But tell us one of your favorite stories in the book.
One of my favorite stories was shared with me by a Lakota man. And he was a dear friend of mine, also a military veteran. And we were sitting around the fire one time, and we were talking about things. And he wasn't a believer at the time. He was raised very traditional, in the traditional ways of the Lakota people. And his grandfather was a very well-known Lakota medicine man. And as I was sharing things with him, and we were talking about these stories, and he says, "Well, I want to share a story with you." And this story was passed down to him by his grandfather, who was passed down to him by his grandfather. And again, I'm paraphrasing the story. So in the story, in the long ago time, there was a plague in a famine that hit the Lakota people, and this is when they were still more on the East Coast, because the Lakota, if you've ever watched Dances with Wolves, that's the Lakota, and he gave me the permission to tell the story. They used to be East Coast people before they became buffalo hunters and pushed out west, and there was a time where there was a great sickness that came upon the people. So as is custom of a chief, you would go and you would fast and pray for an answer. So this chief would go up to a sacred mountain and fasting and praying would cry out to Creator, Tankashila, maker of all things, creator of the heavens and earth, my people are dying. Is there a song that you can give me that I can sing over my people so that they'll be healed? And he received no answer. So the next day the chief is praying and singing. And again, Tankashila, you who made all things, you created us from the dust of the earth. My people are dying. Is there a plant that you've created that I can make into a medicine for my people? And he received no answer. The third day, again, he's praying and he's crying out, Tankashila, you are the maker of all things, the creator of the universe. You who set the stars in place and the moon and the sun. My people are dying. Is there a dance that you can give me a vision of that I can dance in warfare for my people so that they'll be healed? And there was no answer. So that fourth day, the chief is praying and he's empowered as he's been fasting and he's crying out, one more time, please, Creator, is there something? My people are dying. And as he's crying out, the Creator sent a spirit messenger to this chief. And the spirit messenger opened a window in the sky. And he told the chief, look through this window for your answer. And so the chief looked through the window in the sky and he saw a man that was pierced and hanging on a tree. Wow. And the spirit being said, he is dying, so your people will live. And as the window began to close, the chief said, wait, what is his name? So that we can honor him with a dance and remember that he has given his life so we can live. Because amongst our people, there's no greater honor than to give your life for another. And the spirit being said, his name is Bright Morning Star. Remember his name.
Wow.
And that's what the old ones say. That's how it was passed down. And that is the origin of the Sundance. And I sit there and I was listening to this story just stunned.
Absolutely.
You know, as a traditional medicine man is sharing this with me, a story about Jesus, about Yeshua. You know, that very clearly, and of course, Bright Morning Star, that sounds like an Indian name. You know, God shows himself to you in a way that you'll understand. You know, and some people may take issue with the spirit being. But what does Hebrew 13 say? Yeah. Angels are ministering spirits.
That's right.
Sent to the heirs of salvation.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating story. And folks, I just want to, you know, Joseph, you are a born-again, spirit-filled Christian, a pastor, and I just want to make that really clear, that what we're doing here is we're kind of bridging back into who Jesus really is. Jesus is not the God of the white man. He's the God of all men. And it's important that we realize that. We're getting, you know, close to the end, so I want to get into this. We didn't cover this, you didn't cover this in the book, but this is an artifact, and we have come to call this the Nephilim lance. The Nephilim lance. Now, we're not saying that this is a replica of it, by the way, but this is exactly what it looked like. And when we were first presented to it, the owner of the artifact laid it on a table, and Chief Joseph and I were there looking at it, and I immediately picked it up and thought it was a sword. And I'm going, well, this is really heavy. It's very difficult to wield as a sword. It weighs about 8.5 pounds. And you looked at us and you said, guys, no, you're looking at it through your cultural lens. Tell us what happened next.
Well, immediately when I saw this, I thought of the oral tradition of the giants. And in the stories of the giants, they would have these war lances. And the old ones say that these war lances, you know, this would have sat on an 8, maybe even a 10-foot wooden shaft that this was attached to.
Wow.
And they would easily, these giants in battle would skewer 2 to 3 warriors at one time. And I mean, you can see just the sheer size of this, that would take place. Also, you know, as everybody was thinking, oh, well, this is a sword, this is a sword. First Nations people, very few worked metal. And when the metal was worked, it was, you know, copper, and it was used for ornaments, earrings, you know.
And this is a bronze artifact.
This is a bronze artifact. Right. To my knowledge, I don't know of any First Nations tribes that worked bronze, especially to this shape or manner.
And what's interesting here, folks, is that this artifact was found at an abandoned campsite in the wilds of Michigan. And the owner of it saw it laying on the ground, and he picked it up and basically backpacked it out of here. We have had that tested, and it's very inconclusive of testing. I've written about it. But what's amazing, when you saw it, immediately it goes back and gives validation to the Native American oral tradition. And of course, we find that fascinating. There's another little interesting idea with this particular artifact, and it's as a weight of 8.5 pounds. In the biblical prophetic narrative, it talks about the weight of Ishbi-Benob's spearhead, I think is like 600 shekels. And when you take the shekels and you convert it, it comes down to around 8.5 pounds. So we find that, absolutely fascinating. And look, is it a Nephilim artifact? We don't know. It's still very inconclusive, but once again, it points back to the veracity of the biblical prophetic narrative, which we find that incredibly interesting. What are your closing thoughts here, Chief Joseph? We're down towards the end here. So what's your, just leave us with what's the takeaway basically on that's what the old ones say?
The takeaway is the stories that I've put in the book that I was given permission to share, with the understanding, the permission that I was given was, and this was across the board. All these elders said the fires are coming, the time is short, the people need to know these stories. And I understand from a First Nations perspective, and I know you do as well, why things and this type of knowledge has been so closely guarded by Native Americans, because we've lost so much. But the intensity of what's happening in the earth today, with the earthquakes and the fires and all these elements that are taking place prophetically, we know that people need to be warned. And even the traditionalists, and I have found many of these traditional medicine people are believers. But they would be ostracized by their people.
Sure.
If they said that. But in order to really be traditional, they have to believe the old stories that were passed down from their tribes. But I believe that as First Nations, we have a mandate. And I'm not just talking about Billy Graham's prophecy, but we have a mandate to be the ones that call for forgiveness and reconciliation, because time is short and our Messiah is coming through soon. The chief cornerstone, Yeshua, is coming, and we need to get past all these divisions, all this junk that's getting in the way of us really being a unified body. Jesus, Yeshua, is not going to come back for a dismembered bride. And I believe as First Nations people, as a healed people, through forgiveness, through reconciliation of what's taken place, that we truly can bring the sacred fire, is what we call. We're one small voice in the wilderness, but we were also the last people to be evangelized, the indigenous people of the Americas.
Wow.
And so we have that mandate to take the gospel back to the people that brought the gospel to us and say, look, we're a healed people, and we're a reconciled people, we're a redeemed people. We must do this. And we're seeing that happen. We're seeing this revival that took place, which is why we were here on April 9th. 120 Native people with drums and with shofars came together at the Colosseum, and we released that sound and crying for revival in America. And I really believe that the Lord is listening to that heart's cry, because for those of us who have been hurt the worst, we can love the most through that forgiveness and reconciliation.
Thank you so much for that. Folks, that's what the old ones say. Chief Joseph RiverWind, and also assisted by his lovely wife, Dr. Laura Lynn RiverWind. So here's how to order this book. It's absolutely a great read. Fascinating, Chief. Thanks so much for coming on the record with us. Really appreciate it.